So I'm going to start off with some definitional stuff and maybe a bit of a disclaimer, just so I make sure that we're all on the same page, because the title of the talk is about climate change, commodities and conflict. And when people talk about, there's no one from Global Witness in the room, is there? But when people talk about commodities and conflict, they usually have quite a strict definition of conflict commodities and conflict resources in mind. So these are things like diamonds, for example, is the most well-known one. Gold, oil is another conflict resource, and these are resources or commodities which have a kind of a two-way relationship with conflict. So you have conflict over access and control of these resources, but also the revenues from these resources are usually recycled back into the conflict, so fueling it further. So that there's diamonds in Sierra Leone and DRC are the classic examples. Gold in DRC is another example. Timber and oil are other conflict commodities that are listed and dealt with. You can argue to an extent that food is a conflict commodity, certainly insofar as it is fought over in war zones, and that that different sides in conflicts will struggle to gain access to food and use it to control populations and undermine governments. And there's been a big debate in the humanitarian space about the way in which humanitarian food aid should be delivered and whether it should actually be delivered at all in conflict zones such as Somalia, because it runs the risk of being captured by militias. So, for example, in the case of Somalia, the US has been very anxious and initially blocking distribution of food aid in Somalia or in regions of Somalia for fear that it will be captured by the Al-Shabaab Islamic militias. But all of that aside, I want to take a slightly different angle in this talk, and I want to focus particularly on agricultural commodities, so food, but also to kind of expand it beyond commodities to include the factors of production for food, so specifically land and water, because I think they're very relevant to conflict and they're also very relevant to climate change. And when I talk about conflict, I'm probably going to take a slightly broader definition, so not just violent conflict, but also political conflict. So let's start off with food and think about what's been happening with food. I don't know how well this shows up, but basically what this chart does, this is from a paper that was published recently this year, and the black dotted line is the FAO food index over the last few years, and where there's a red vertical line, this is a case of political instability where riots happened in a particular country. The numbers in parentheses are the number of deaths that resulted as a result of the riots or the protests or whatever happened. Now, we're not actually saying here that each of these riots was directly attributable to food price rises, international food price rises, but what you do see is a clustering of riots around food price spikes. And in the cases of countries like Burundi, which is off there at the left-hand side, although it's very hard to argue that that would have been triggered by international food price rises, at that particular point in time, there were national problems around food availability. So there was still a food access linkage there. And the authors of this report actually did a statistical analysis and came to the conclusion that there is a threshold in international food prices above which political instability becomes more likely. Now, this isn't to say that food prices and access to food are directly responsible for causing riots. There's been a huge debate about this, for example, with the Arab Spring events this year. But what it does indicate is that they can be a contributory factor, they can be a spark for broader discontent, they can play into existing social, political tensions. I think there's a famous quote from Josette Sheeran, who's the director of the World Food Programme, that without food people have only three options: they riot, they emigrate, or they die. And she would argue that in this case they've chosen to riot on a large number of occasions. There are examples from the historical record of political instability and riots and conflict breaking out in direct response to food price rises, but there aren't many, and you have to sort of go back to the 1800s in Europe, where there was a series of droughts, and then further back again to the French Revolution, where again there were broader issues as well. One thing I would flag here is that these are all examples of civil conflict, so conflict and violence within countries. These are not examples of interstate wars. And the evidence of interstate conflict around food is much more shaky. What's been happening with water? So there's a website called www.worldwater.org, which has a database of water-related conflicts. So I had a look on there to see what had happened since 2000. There are 69 water-related conflicts that have been reported. Typically, these are pretty small scale. These are actually more community level than national level. And they are concentrated, of course, as you would expect, in regions, first of all, with weak institutions, low levels of development, but also water scarcity and water stress. So East Africa, West Africa are two regions of the world where these sorts of things seem to crop up. In larger scale conflicts, the role of water scarcity, again, as a kind of a trigger, contributor, a spark, a stressor, a remote actor, these are all terms from the literature, a stress multiplier, has been written about quite extensively. It's not accepted completely across academia, but there is quite a large body of literature that would argue that water scarcity played a role in contributing to tensions between particular communities, both in the case of the Rwandan genocide and the more recent Darfur conflict. And of course, these things rapidly spiraled way beyond concerns of water security and access to land. But it's been argued that these issues were triggers there as well. Again, interstate conflict is rare. There is some evidence to suggest that countries that share a river basin are more likely to enter into conflict with one another than countries that share a regular land border. But actually, when you look for the evidence, it tends to be concentrated in a couple of particular regions, Middle East in particular, conflict over Jordan and Euphrates, involving Israel and Palestine, very often is one of the most widely reported conflicts. What you tend to see happening more with water at the interstate level are agreements, cooperation agreements, and so there's a narrative around water that actually things tip more towards cooperation between countries than conflict. I think in reality that masks the fact that these cooperation agreements tend to have a very powerful, often militarily strong partner and then a number of weaker partners, and that they are often very far from equitable. And they rarely go much beyond measuring things like flow levels. So in terms of sort of ensuring equitable access to the scarce resource, they don't really get into that space. And as we've seen recently with the Nile Basin Initiative, which was probably one of the biggest cooperation agreements, has actually recently fallen apart because of increasing tensions between the countries that are upstream and downstream. Thinking about land and conflict, this is a chart from the Oxfam report that Richard's already mentioned, and what this shows, again, the line is the FAO Food Price Index, and the bars are the number of monthly reported media stories on land grabs, which is a pejorative term. Not always is the land being grabbed, often it's being invested in very reasonable circumstances, but this terminology has taken hold. The issue here, very often, I think, is that these investments are happening typically in countries with weak institutions, in very untransparent and opaque circumstances. Communities often aren't being consulted, they're being displaced, moved aside, sometimes forcibly. It's also concentrating land in the hands of sometimes elites, often investors, overseas investors, And I think there's a very strong argument that this is sowing the seeds for future conflict, because very often in sub-Saharan African countries, for example, land is something of huge cultural significance. The majority of people, of the poorest people, still exist in rural areas. They rely on land as a critical resource for their livelihoods, not just to grow food, but for all sorts of other livelihood strategies as well. And so I have a real concern that there are a number of countries which are, becoming pressure cookers for community level and national level conflict and political instability around land and increasing concentration of land. Again, at the international level, there are very few examples of conflict over land between states, but if you don't have to go back too far in history to find the term Lebensraum, living space. And with Nazi Germany, one of the justifications for rolling into Poland was to increase the amount of land available and space available for the German population. But I think the point I'd like people to take away from this slide is that land investment is not conflict neutral. And if it's not handled in a way that is transparent and inclusive, then it is sowing the seeds further down the line for conflict. And you don't have to look very far to find examples of where that is already happening. Palm oil in Indonesia, there's all sorts of conflict going on there. Institutions are very weak. The land regime, the land laws are completely confusing. There's customary land title, there's private land title. The two are often mutually exclusive. There's national level regulations, there's subnational level and local regulations, there's different levels of authority. It's very hard to work out what's going on, and there's often violent conflict as a result. So just thinking through a little bit about how all of this meshes together with the added factor of climate change. The way I've tried to conceptualise it is that scarcity around food, water, land has distributional impacts and access impacts for communities, for people. So if their access to these resources is being diminished, it can result in increasing inequality, food insecurity, livelihood insecurity. It could result in health impacts if they don't have access to clean water, for example, or they don't have access to sufficient nutrition. It can result in economic impacts and poverty. It can also drive social and political tensions, particularly if access is being granted along social lines, political patronage lines, or if the phenomenon of resource capture and rent seeking is taking place flagrantly in front of marginalised populations. And of course all of these things can contribute to conflicts. They can help sow the seeds, create the conditions for conflict. Any one of them will not be a direct cause of conflict, because that's just not the way conflict happens. It's much more complicated than that, but they can help create the conditions for that. What climate change does is increase the probability of these sorts of scarcity issues feeding through to creating these social, political, economic impacts which create the conditions for conflict. So you can imagine, for example, melting glaciers resulting in problems around access to water, sea level rise, reducing the availability of arable land, for example, desertification, drought, flood, yield declines, and shifting seasons. All of these things can have distributional access and availability impacts on food, water, and land. Then the picture rapidly becomes more complicated, because when, as Josette Sheeran pointed out, conflict isn't the only response from these kinds of social and political impacts. Another response could be migration. And migration isn't necessarily international, it can be national. In fact, more often than not, it is within national boundaries, or at least regional areas. But what happens here again, of course, is that you get new influxes of displaced people, migrating people, who increase competition for perhaps already scarce resources, increased social tensions, and again, the process feeds on itself, and the odds of conflict are increased. You could add in as other multipliers, not necessarily with a feedback loop, things like increasing population. If you look at where population growth is concentrated, it's concentrated in the poorest, most food insecure, institutionally weakest countries in the world. Bioenergy is increasing competition for land and water. Biofuels are a big factor in reducing the overall availability of land for food production. Urbanisation, increasing area taken up by cities, increasing demand for water from cities, increasing demand for food from cities could be creating these sorts of tensions, and similarly industrialisation. So there's other things you could add in here, but I've tried to keep it simple for the purposes of this discussion. What do you do about all of this? Well, there's different intervention points and different policies. With climate change, the first thing you should be trying to do is prevent it. So mitigation has a role to play. Adaptation has a role to play in putting in place policies, institutions, governance frameworks to help deal with scarcity and the impacts of climate change. Trade has a role to play in helping people smooth consumption, diversify risks, gain access to resources that they might not otherwise have. It also needs to be managed in a proper way. So if we look back at what happened in 2008 in the food price crisis then, we saw over 30 countries impose export bans in response to domestic pressures, but the result of this was to drive up international prices much, much, much further than would have happened otherwise. Resource governance. If you actually look at the frameworks in place globally and at national levels to deal with access to scarce resources, to ensure equitable access, to ensure that usage remains within environmental and sustainable limits, there really are very few examples of where this is happening properly. I mean, it's really hard to find. And so these sorts of policies have a real role to play, and they need to be brought forwards. And then, of course, social policies, social protection, social insurance, providing safety nets to vulnerable people, which help them cope with these shocks and will make them less angry and suffer less in the event of these shocks. All of these things have a role to play. You could add food aid, you could add peace building in here as well. There's various policy responses, but these are complicated things. I mean, all of these things that I've mentioned, mitigation, adaptation, trade policy, resource governance, social protection, they cost a lot of money. They have political economy impacts. They have distributional impacts themselves. So moving these agendas forwards is expensive and very difficult. That's kind of where we are now. The point I want to make here is that the potential for conflict is rising. If you take the case of food, all the models are predicting long-term structural increases in international food prices, well below long-run recent levels, a little bit below recent spike levels, but it represents a massive structural increase in food prices. And the point I would make is that volatility and shocks come on top of this. So shocks due to extreme weather events, shocks due to countries imposing export bans, shocks due to a spiralling oil price, these things come on top of an already higher food price. So the potential for conflict as a result of international food prices spiking, I think, is going to increase into the future. As I already said, population growth is going to be concentrated precisely in the regions which are most vulnerable to these kinds of impacts and have the weakest institutions to start with. We don't have the right global governance and institutions in place to deal with food price shocks. We saw that happen in 2008 with export bans. The G20 tried to grapple with these issues this year at the agriculture ministers, but the political economy of agreeing a way to deal with trade issues and international distributional issues is extremely difficult, because if you're India and you're worried about domestic riots in response to high food prices, it's very tempting to impose export controls and push the international prices up a little bit further. That's the political incentives under which politicians operate under. And finally, very few people have access to social protection of any kind. Globally, about 1 in 5 people have access to social protection. And very often that's not going to be the kind of social protection that's going to help you with a food price shock. So basically the kinds of institutions and policies that we need to see in place aren't there, and things are going to get worse very quickly. I'm sorry this isn't an uplifting presentation. On water, demand for water is set to increase 30% by 2030. Glacial melt due to climate change will increase water scarcity along critical multi-state river systems. The Ganges is the obvious one. It goes through India, Pakistan, I think, Bangladesh. The number of people that depend on it for their water supplies is mind-boggling. It's a significant fraction of humanity. I can't remember the exact number. Mekong, similarly, is fed by the Himalayan glaciers. 60 million people depend on that river for their livelihoods. You've got China at one end of it, and then a number of very poor countries at the other end of it. So there are big questions around how the political economy of that particular water resource will pay out. Water tables, reservoirs and aquifers are falling in already stressed regions and countries around the world. The Middle East has had a huge decline in aquifers and the water table there, which has seen countries such as Saudi Arabia and Gulf states seeking to basically outsource their food production in Africa, often in very unstable parts of Africa. Who knows where that, what the conflict potential for these sorts of issues is in the medium to longer term. China faces very serious water security issues domestically. Lake Chad, again in East Africa, a conflict-prone zone of the world. The level of Lake Chad has been decimated in recent years, due mainly to irrigation for agriculture, but climate change may also be playing a role there. A really interesting point, I think, is in the developing world, agriculture is on a head-on collision course with industrialisation and urbanisation. So globally, agriculture accounts for something like 70% of global freshwater use. In developing countries, it's more like 90%. In rich countries, water use looks something like 60% urban, 40% agriculture. So part of development is shifting that balance. But in a context of rapidly increasing population, rapidly increasing urbanisation, rapidly increasing industrialisation, and declining water availability due to climate change and other factors, it's increasingly hard to manage that tension. And we're already seeing cases of conflict between agriculture and industrial and energy generation sectors in a number of developing countries. India is one example. Often it's the most vulnerable communities that lose out. So it's the smallholder farmers that lose access to water first, then it's the big agribusiness companies second. And finally, of course, governance and regulation is typically weak. So on the case of water, most developing countries lack frameworks to price water and therefore incentivise its economic use. They lack governance frameworks to allocate user rights. And as I've already said, the regional frameworks, the cross-border frameworks are inequitable and go little beyond measuring water flows. And I've already mentioned potential for conflict inland. I mean, an interesting statistic here, since about 1960, the amount of arable land per person has almost halved. And that trend is increasing. It's on a steady trend due to population growth and competition for land from other resources and the need to increase food production. Do I want to say anything else about land? I don't think I do. So let's go on to conclusions because I'm talking too much. So in conclusion, climate change will increase food insecurity. It's the poorest countries that are going to be the most vulnerable. It's a threat multiplier for conflict. So it has the potential to exacerbate existing socio-economic tensions, and it has the potential to increase scarcity. The potential for violence is greater within countries, but I would warn that in a 5-degree warming scenario by the end of the century, the potential for conflict between countries, I think, is going to be pretty significant. I was at a meeting of scientists in 2009 before the Copenhagen conference where Joseph Schellnhuber stood up and gave a presentation looking at the Earth's long-term carrying capacity in a scenario of 5 degrees of warming, and he estimated it was less than 1 billion people. And as a lot of you have probably seen, the latest UN forecast for global population by the end of the century are well in excess of that. We're into double figures of billions of people. So that in itself suggests to me that the potential for interstate conflict could be huge unless serious action is taken on mitigation. And finally, current institutions, frameworks and resources are inadequate. That applies both at national and international levels. I was also asked to say a few words about the implications for Durban of all of this. I don't think the implications for Durban really are very much at all, and the reason for that is that the climate change negotiations follow their own kind of logic. They have their own agenda, they have their own working groups, they have their own subject issues. It's very difficult to get new issues and new avenues into those discussions. Often it may be unwise to do so because they're already complicated enough, and everything is held hostage to everything else, which means it's very hard to move them forwards. And the political will for really talking about the downsides of climate change, how terrible it could potentially be, simply isn't there at the moment. The economic crisis has meant that politicians have retreated away from wanting to talk about the need to invest in mitigation, the potential problems that climate change poses, the need to finance climate change action in developing countries. These are all toxic political narratives at the moment, which make it very hard really to push an agenda like the one we've just been discussing into the international negotiations. Again, utterly depressing. I wish I could follow on a more upbeat note, but that is my personal opinion, and I'd be very happy if somebody wanted to challenge it. Thank you.